Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to this water lecture series. This water lecture series has its own history. It's organized by the Center for Development Research, the UN Water Decade Program on Capacity Development, the University of Bonn, that's the Geography Department, or the unit of water at the Geography Department of the University of Bonn, the German Development Institute, and the UNU-EHS, the Institute for Environment and Human Security. So it's a sort of a consortium of different organizations. On these occasions, especially, we just do this World Water Lecture for a World Water Day that is marked every year on March 22nd. For this year, the theme is water, sustainable development, water and sustainable development. And the topic of the presentation is water and sustainable development, positioning water and capacity development in the sustainable development goals. Let me briefly introduce Uta Wehn. Dr. Uta is a senior researcher, lecturer, and researcher in capacity development in innovation at the UNESCO-IHE Institute for Water Studies in the Netherlands. She has a background on information and technology and communication technology, and she has also MSc and PhD in science and technology policy. She has more than 17 or 18 years of combined industrial and research experience, and majority of it is on managing and conducting applied research for clients, including the United Nations, the European Commission, Dutch government, USAID, Europe, and many other organizations. At present, her research focuses on the dynamics of the learning and innovation, competence building systems. And she's also responsible for many different projects like this Wehn, big project, which is Citizen Observatories of Water. And she's also the scientific program director for UNESCO-IHE, and she represents also UNESCO-IHE at OECD in development in initiative on water governance. And our discussant for today is Dr. Saravanan Subramanian. He is from ZEF. I think he is known to many of you here. He is a senior researcher at ZEF. Saravanan has also BA, MSc, and PhD from 3 different continents. First in India, from Madras University, and then he went on to the University of Cambridge in the UK, and then University of Queensland in Australia. So at ZEF, he leads this water and health research and, at the center. And he's also leading a working group on metabolism of urban water and its health implications under this water and Science Alliance program. And he specialized on water-related health risk and rapidly growing economy, especially with a focus on South and Central Asia. With this, I think, let me give the floor to Uta. You're welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Daniel, and thank you also for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. To give the lecture, but also I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and learn more about your work and your interest and your experience with capacity development. I will not spend too much time talking about IHE, partly because some of you, I think, know it quite well already, and partly because I think we'll get to it halfway through the lecture anyway. So, the lecture is taking place while all eyes are on water because it's World Water Day. Now, UN Water has selected this very nice range of images to really illustrate how cross-cutting and how important water really is. If we start at the top, it's water for food, water for ecosystems, for industry, for energy, urbanization, equality. And I think all of these images are selected quite well, except for water and hygiene. I have some trouble with relating to a photo of a child in a swimming pool. But anyway, I think it sets the scene quite well, to really for us to appreciate just how cross-cutting, how important water is, and therefore also why we need to consider it within the Sustainable Development Agenda setting. Now, of course, you would expect me to say that. I come from UNESCO-IHE Institute for Water Education. So let's look at some other evidence that can shed some light. Now, I think the lighting is not ideal. What you're supposed to see is a little bubble at the top right. Because if we look in terms of likelihood and impact, what the recent global risk report from the World Economic Forum has found that actually water crises, freshwater-related water crises are the absolute top risk, both in terms of putting together likelihood and impact. And then if we look separately, when they list the risks that they have identified, the top 10 in terms of likelihood, it's still amongst the top 10, but on place 8. But in terms of impact, the impact that water crises have on the world and various parts of the world is absolutely number 1. And then if we look at the, more broadly at the environmental risks, how the experts that have been interviewed for to provide a basis for the report, at the societal risks, and also at the economic risks, what we see is that the environmental risks and the societal risks with water crisis at the top are expected to even increase over the next 10 years. Interestingly, even though it may not feel that way, the economic crisis still overshadowing us. Actually, the economic risks are being perceived to be less prominent compared to environmental risks. They're really being overshadowed by the environmental risks, and this trend is expected to increase over the next 10 years. So water matters, and water matters particularly in 2015, when all eyes are not just on water, but on the Sustainable Development Goals. This agenda is being set, and so the whole point is for you to appreciate the process that has happened so far in terms of positioning water within that agenda-setting process. And not only water, but capacity development for the water sector, which is, of course, what IHE's work is all about. So in order to look at this process, we have to sort of benchmark ourselves and, of course, go back to what happened before the SDG process, which is the MDGs. I'm sure most of you are familiar, and you can just do a Mexican wave to wave me through these slides if I say too much of the obvious. But the MDGs had a number of good things that they brought to the development world. And that is really to help overcome aid fatigue, put the focus on results-based management within development work, and really brought development back on the public agendas. They were global goals, but they were really aiming at the developing countries. And as you all know, they're coming to an end this year. So what are the lessons? Well, I'm sure we have different lessons, but let me propose my lessons. Right, the process has been criticized, I'm sure, broadly, and you're quite aware of it, to really say this was really a top-down process. This was really driven by national governments. There was just, it was really perceived as being a donor agenda, rather than something that went through a comprehensive stakeholder engagement exercise. And yes, they were really motivating for the donors, but then the evidence for the developing countries is perhaps less clear. And so we are now in the age where, for the last couple of years, we've been busy trying to figure out what comes next. What comes next are the Sustainable Development Goals, and these have a much broader scope because whatever the outcomes of the Sustainable Development Goals are relevant to all countries, and not just the developing countries. And that's because the situation is so different now. We have new emerging powers, we have the BRICS countries, we have the economic financial crisis, even though the World Economic Forum now says it doesn't matter so much anymore. But we also have an increasing realization that is reflected in the report of that we are reaching the planetary boundaries. So we need to do something jointly, something that affects all countries. That's the rationale behind the Sustainable Development Goals. Here's a slide that's trying to capture the process that has been going on since 2012, and we really see it's a number of parallel tracks, a number of more formal, informal tracks, but really trying to capture quite a broad range of stakeholders. The green boxes are refers to the open working group on sustainable development. Then we have the high-level panel. We get to both of these in a second. The country consultations and the thematic consultations, but also a whole range of non-UN activities that go beyond the formal institutions. So the high-level panel, this is one of those slides where I should be expecting a Mexican wave. So the high-level panel was made up of eminent persons, David Cameron and the president of Indonesia and Liberia. They were really in charge of this process to advise on the broader global development framework. They were mandated in 2012. They did the report. It was discussed at the General Assembly. And in parallel, the Open Working Group was suggested as one of the outcomes to have this Open Working Group. This was, came out of the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012. started its work actually in 2013 after a lot of struggling of what the composition of this group should actually be. There were some 70 seats. There was a lot of negotiation going on between countries of who should these seats be given to. Some countries actually shared the seat. And also they have delivered their report last year, and it was discussed in the General Assembly. And they went also through a very challenging process of really developing and defining sustainable development goals, but also the process of implementation that would go along with these sustainable development goals and the true ownership of these goals. And one of the other parallel tracks was also that global conversation that was being aimed for, to really do a quite different approach compared to the Millennium Development Goals, to really say, let's try and get as much stakeholder input on these goals, on all these developments. There were a number of thematic consultations, bringing together a whole broad range of stakeholders and to make concrete suggestions. Some of these were face-to-face, some of these were in-country consultations with invited stakeholders, and a lot of it was also online. And then there were a huge number of other lobbying initiatives as well. I quite like this map. It's been described before as either a bouquet of flower or a bowl of spaghetti. You can take your pick of what speaks to you most, but I think it nicely illustrates at least the effort that had been made to produce a process, to generate a process that's distinctly different from the process in which the MDGs had been produced. So we really see, yes, the United Nations at the center of it, but we see a whole number of other organizations, multilateral organizations, but also the research community feeding into it, the private sector, civil society organizations, and also, of course, the governments. So, where does the connection with water and SDG come in? The main thing was to say, well, within this whole process, within this process of devising the SDGs, there was quite a strong movement to say, well, the water-related SDG is not going to be the same as the water and sanitation MDG. Just for your recollection, MDG goal number 7, ensuring environmental sustainability, had a number of targets related to water. Target 7B to water resources, and target 7C, I think, is probably the more known water-related target, with aiming for the drinking water and sanitation provision, improvements in the proportion of the population. So, yes, that was perhaps done for the MDGs because that was quite a tangible way of capturing water and capturing attention for water. As Joachim Harlin from the UNDP put it, it got high political traction and a lot of awareness in that way. And also you can argue, and many people have done so, that of course water was implicitly included in many of the other MDGs. But for the discourse on the SDGs, there was a strong opinion forming to say that water is really much more than wash, and you will remember the photos I showed you at the beginning. That's the whole rationale discourse behind that, to really say it's far more than water supply and sanitation, or even water resource management. You have floods and droughts, you have climate change adaptation, which is clearly linked to water, etc., water ecosystems. So what was really going on is that many players, many actors within the water sector, if we are allowed to call it that way, were positioning themselves. There was a lot of force and emphasis to say, yes, water is cross-cutting, yes, it's very important, but where are we going to be? We really need one big goal. We need to be really recognizable. So AMCO, the African Ministerial Council of Water, said we need to ensure a water secure world for all, and that includes having a one unified goal. The UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Water and Sanitation, UNSCAP, they also wanted the global goal on water. And IHE was also supporting the idea of a very comprehensive goal on water. And then we have Jeffrey Sachs and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that you may be aware of. That was Jeffrey Sachs had, of course, he's not only a well-known and well-criticized economist, development economist, He was also an advisor on the MDGs, and he was also being appointed to run this Sustainable Development Solutions Network that was initiated by Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, in 2012. And this solutions network was supposed to bring the insights from science, civil society, and the private sector together. And they came at quite a different direction at water and said, well, no, it's cross-cutting. It's cross-cutting, and so are a lot of other issues. So you're not going to have your water goal. We have distinct goals, and we have cross-cutting issues, just like gender, touches upon a lot of other issues, just like governance. It's one of our cross-cutting themes. And that's also where water is going to be. So this was some of the content-related discourse, also in terms of where do we position ourselves strategically. If we really want to have an impact in the SDGs of really being recognized, do we want to be recognized for our cross-cutting nature, that waters are cross-cutting, or do we want to have our own goal with very specific targets that we can then try to achieve? That's the water-related discourse. I would just, perhaps as a footnote, like to add that I'm not trying to take position on what Jeffrey Sachs and his network are proposing, but what I do like is some of the things more generally that he was proposing about the SDGs. And that was to say, well, you guys, you know, with your long list of goals, that's all very well, but what are we trying to do here? We're trying to have effective change in the world, because the way we are going on is no longer possible. Business as usual is not sustainable. So what are these SDGs for? What are you going to do with them? Is it just another long wash list and wish list? No, if they're going to have any effect, you need to make them so simple. But so simple that every primary school child can recite them, has internalized them, knows them off by heart. And that's when we get behavioral change. And as one of my colleagues would put it, that's a view I can sympathize with. You might know him. So let's get back to the water-related SDGs. I think what's quite interesting to note is the thematic consultations that were going on. Two things. One is there were initially 9 themes, and then there were 11. And the 2 that came latest were energy and water. And then you look at this chart of where was the most input, most activity, most discussion in that online thematic consultation. It's the big blue bar on the left, and it's water. So it was perceived as a very important topic, and a lot of comments and input came, and that fed into the reports. Each of these thematic themes produced their own reports. The one on water argued that the water crisis that we also heard from the World Economic Forum about is really a governance crisis. They also proposed a broader, perhaps more comprehensive view on water sanitation, hygiene, water resource management, but also wastewater management, and also looking out for water quality. That should feature prominently, but they didn't quite as far as saying that needs to be its own goal. But also interestingly, they also commented on the need for having water-related capacity development. So, in the meantime, a lot of reports have been produced. The Open Working Group came up with its list, and also the high-level panel came up with its recommended lists. Just coincidentally, I guess, both of them have goal number 6, focused on water. So in both of these very formal mechanisms, water came out very clearly with its own goal. So a lot of the water sector community went, hurrah! And the high-level panel has something reasonably close to the MDG goal, but it goes, okay, to freshwater withdrawals. We can argue that that's still part of the water resources that the MDG considered, but also wastewater. And the Open Working Group came up with a far more comprehensive goal, not just in the number of words it chose to describe that goal in targets, but also in the aspects of water that it included beyond wash, but also ecosystems, water scarcity, etc. And then having the goals defined, of course, is one step, but the next step is defining the targets, which both groups did, but getting down to the indicator level. And that, not just for water, but for all the SDGs, is a very difficult, very comprehensive process. We really, especially for water, if we want to try and capture all those aspects and really pin them down with smart indicators that are measurable, etc. That process so far is going on more or less behind the scenes. There's very little transparency at this stage. What is available right now is, again, Jeffrey Sachs and his development network. And they have published their indicators, their proposed indicators, but they also indicate where there are gaps, where they haven't gotten as far as they would like to. And as I said before, they are really coming at it from a scientific perspective. They also work very closely together with the private sector, with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So they have also gone through their multi-stakeholder process in order to produce these indicators. And the second aspect that I would like to mention, of course, is in this discourse is not only how do we position water in the SDGs, but how do we position capacity development in the SDGs, because that was a concept or a need that was certainly not included in the early phases of this discourse. So, of course, UNESCO-IHE is, we have the mission to strengthen the water sector in developing countries through capacity development, education, and research. So, of course, we felt, well, we have to do something. And we did a number of events. We had an expert meeting on water-related SDGs and capacity development. We also had our symposium that we hold every 5 to 6 years with a very strong focus on the link between capacity development and the SDGs. And we also fed into the Budapest Water Summit. And importantly, there's a little photo that came up on the bottom right. I don't know if some of you recognize it, but these are the two co-chairs of the Open Working Group. At the left of them, Ambassador Kuroji, a permanent representative to the United Nations of Hungary, he came to our events. So we had a very direct link to what was going on in the Open Working Group, and we sort of pulled his ear and said, capacity development is really important. If you're trying to do something with water in your SDGs, don't forget capacity development. But why are we doing this? Why are we saying this? Well, this is where we come to what IHE is really about. IHE has been around for almost 60 years. We by now have almost 15,000 alumni, although admittedly perhaps some of them have retired by now. And these alumni are alumni that have gone through our postgraduate education at MSc or at PhD level. We have some 200, 220 MSc students every year. We have a PhD program of 140, 150 PhDs. And so these are evolving over the years into quite a substantial amount of alumni. Now, luckily, most of them don't go through the process of brain drain and stick around in Delft, but they actually go back to their home countries or to other developing countries and help strengthen the water sector, or so we would like to think. And so we did think for a long time until we realized, well, training people is very well and good. Educating them at high postgraduate level is excellent, but it's just not enough. Because we were managing the alumni network very well, so we get a lot of feedback, we do tracer studies, we see what people do, where they end up, their career prospects. Of course, their career prospects are great because they're far better educated than most people in their country, most people within their organization. And sometimes that's even the problem. Because they come back and they're so smart and they know so much more than their boss, than their colleagues, that they're not always allowed to apply what they've learned. That they're not always allowed to run the show the way in which they would like to. So what we've realized is there were a lot of constraints. So training individuals is not enough. So here we come to a very small conceptual section about, well, what is it then? What we mean when we say we're building capacity. When we talk about capacity, we really talk, yes, about the individual, about people's knowledge, experience, and their skills, but also their attitude. What do they want? What do they want to do with the things that they've acquired, that they've learned? Are they really happy to put it into working practice? But people don't work in isolation. They work in a professional environment. They work typically in organizations, smaller or larger organizations. And organizations, we can also say organizations have capacity. What is that? Well, that's really the procedures and routines by which the organization structures its work. It's also knowledge management. How do we keep the knowledge base up to date? How do we allow people to apply the skills they have? How do we make sure that they share what they've learned at IHE when they come back? They train others or they give presentations, but also the whole incentive system. Right? Do we get the best out of people because we have performance-related pay, or we make sure that they have a career progression, or that they can follow another training if they think they need it? These are just examples. And organizations don't work in isolation. They work within an enabling environment alongside other organizations. And again, that enabling environment can be indeed enabling, but it can also often be very disabling. And the environment then consists of the policies and strategies, the political priorities that are being set, but also the legal and regulatory frameworks that can either be enabling or disabling. And then last but not least, all of this is taking place within civil society, which certainly in the water sector has its role to play in terms of water literacy and resilience. This is, if you like, the overview of the capacity system that we talk about, that we think about when we talk about capacity development. And it really shows that when we do capacity development, it's really an effort across all these layers. Addressing individual levels is good, but not sufficient. And that also, it's important to note, of course, capacity development is not a means and an end in itself, but a means to achieving better performance of various organizations, not just utilities. And of course, the enabling environment can change, various other factors can change, and so the problems will change, and therefore capacity has to change as well. So this is really a moving system, and therefore also a moving target in some ways. So taking this as a backdrop, what's often asked then is to say, well, what is institutional capacity then? Well, in our view, institutional capacity, if we really link it back to political science, then of course institutions are the rules of the game. And they apply to organizations as much as they apply to the enabling environment. So when we talk about institutional capacity, we're really talking about these two layers. And it's these two layers that we really want to address with the capacity development projects in the countries themselves, where our alumni work or where there are needs for capacity development. And just to give you a brief snapshot, these are some of the approaches, some of the capacity development modalities, if you like, that we use. We help organizations with their knowledge management procedures and routines. We help countries through a process of setting up national strategies for capacity development to overcome a patchwork of effort on capacity development. But also, and this is an example I will go into just a little bit more, we help, for example, utilities to draw up performance improvement plans. Now, in a nutshell, a performance improvement plan is really just a roadmap for achieving certain strategic objectives. For example, providing universal service of access to water. And this performance improvement plan can be actually a means of doing action learning with a number of utilities, because that's not an individual exercise or an individual problem that one utility faces, but several. So by putting them together through this learning exercise and learning from each other, they can come up and draw up their own plans. There's a number of stages involved, so a lot of preparatory activities to really take stock and benchmark of what's the current capacity, what are the current problems they are facing, then drawing up a whole list of work packages or a menu of a wish list of these are all the things that ideally we would get done. We would tackle non-revenue water, we would tackle the GIS system, we would fix all the pipes, etc. But then there's usually a budget that sort of limits to what extent that wish list can really be implemented. And then selections have to be made, buy-in processes have to be gone through, and that can be supported by additional consultations, for example. So what is our role in this whole process? Of course, we have a very strong role in the beginning, really helping utilities through the self-assessment exercise, taking stock, etc., defining the work packages. But by the time you get down to making hard selections, defending choices to management, they are really in charge. So by then that process has really shifted to a more locally driven development process where the local utility, various levels of management are very strongly involved. So that was just a very brief example, if you like, a case study of what do we really mean by capacity development, how does it work out in practice, and why does it really matter for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But if we want to then see, well, what happens within the SDGs, again, we have to benchmark ourselves and say, well, what happened in the MDGs? And if you look at it, capacity was mentioned exactly once in the MDGs, and it was trade capacity. It had nothing to do with the kind of capacity that we're really after. So very little attention, one might conclude. Let's look at what the high-level panel proposed on capacity development. We have the 12 goals here. Wow, came up exactly twice. Once, strengthening productive capacity by providing universal access to financial services, infrastructure, etc. Now, important things, surely, and the second one relates to the security forces, police, judiciary, also very important, but still not quite what we were, of course, looking for coming from a water sector perspective, or even a broader capacity builder perspective. And the open working group had proposed 17 goals, so even a longer list. And there the checklist in terms of what is happening, what focuses on capacity development, is quite a different picture. It is actually mentioned in more than 10 goals and in more than 20 targets for those 10 goals, really have a very clear capacity or capabilities focus. And then goal number 6, and you will remember, goal number 6 is related to water, specifically focuses on capacity building for water. And then the goal number 11, which is really very broadly concerned with the financial, technological, capacity building aspects of the implementation aspects of all the SDGs, again, focuses very specifically on capacity building. So where are we now then? What can we say about the SDGs so far? Are they just like the MDGs? Are they just another communications tool, and this time, well, perhaps a more effective one, because they seem to have gotten so many people talking, so many people engaged? And yes, they seem to set out a vision, whichever version we pick, whether we pick the high-level panel, whether we pick the open working group. But we're still in a stage of negotiation. And when we're in a stage of negotiation, we still need to make it to paper, and then we need to make it to reality. There's still quite some way to go. And the means of implementation discussion is certainly also still very strong, is still going on between the countries, saying, well, who's going to pay for all this? Who's going to make sure that the implementation actually happens, that we go beyond the vision, beyond the defined targets and indicators, but that we actually make it happen? How do we split this across the southern and northern countries? And is this really a means of affecting change? And is it this time a more bottom-up process, or is it a mixed process, or is it only top-down? As you can see, in 2015, there's still quite some steps that are going on. Quite some discussion, quite some definition. So by the autumn, hopefully we'll be there and we'll have the agreed-upon SDGs on the table, if indeed that's what the countries, at the end of the day, that's what the governments decide on. But in terms of affecting change and having more bottom-up movement, the high-level panel already mentioned the data revolution. Because one of the problems with the MDGs was to really, they were focusing on collecting data at a very aggregate level. And if you disaggregated it, you got a very different story. When overall targets may have been met at a local level, the story was quite different. And I have very concrete examples from my students at IHE who had to play that role within their country and said, quite frankly, we could put any photo in that report and claim that targets had been met when in fact nothing had been done, or no infrastructure was being sustained in the long run. So it was a process that was not really watertight in terms of monitoring properly whether targets had been met and whether they would continue to be met. So the high-level panel mentioned the data revolution, and perhaps this is where technology comes in as a game changer. Most of you will have a mobile phone in your pocket, some of you even two, I guess. Anybody who doesn't have one, doesn't own one, you don't need to have it here, but doesn't own one? No, well. And it's the same in developing countries. perhaps even a higher rate. And the adoption of ICTs, and particularly mobile phones, is still accelerating. So that's actually giving quite an important, powerful monitoring tool to people at a very local grassroots level to say, well, is it really true? Do I really have better access to water? And not just once, but continuously. Oh, this was too fast. And feed this into the monitoring process of the SDGs. What can we conclude on? Well, it seems that the water has found its place in the SDGs. Two important reports from the high-level panel and from the Open Working Group have made a very clear pitch for it, although in scope they differ. But also very important to note is this very paradigmatic shift of attention to capacity development and attention to implementation, of really implementing these goals. So capacity development is really now one of the main vehicles for meeting the SDGs, and not just once, but continuously meeting them. Implementation, especially finance, the special groups going on right now negotiating on the financial aspects, that also has reached far more prominence within the SDG process than it had within the MDGs. And as I just illustrated before, perhaps there's an increasingly important role for citizens, and citizens are all of us in our various roles in our life, to really help monitor the process of implementing the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uta. Your lecture comes at a right time when capacity development is high on the international agenda, and we are not simply talking about education or something. We are actually thinking in terms of institutional change. We are thinking of training people. We are thinking of building knowledge systems in the recipient countries and so on. And your talk comes in a very appropriate time, and to highlight how capacity development is on the SDGs. I hope by the final end of this year, still the capacity is maintained in these SDGs. So I hope so. It'll be maintained and we come out together. But a quite interesting talk, and Dr. Uta Wehn, she has a good experience also working through different projects. But just few clarification and comments also, given her wide range of experience working on the capacity development in worldwide scenario, of course with a country-specific sort of an approach. Many times we talk about, as you pointed out, capacity development at the individual level, at the institutional level, or at the enabling. Of course, institutional is also enabling environment. Where do we focus on these sort of things? As you see right now, many international agencies either focus on research capacity, or it's mainly doctoral students, as you pointed out, even the UNESCO things. But on the institutional role, it is very limited in terms of changing the legislation, in terms of changing the national policy environment, especially in terms of the water supply and sanitation. We have talked lots about the technologies of toilets and the drinking water, but we have talked less about what sort of policy environment is required, what sort of legislations are required in this context. So given that the capacity development is getting high on the agenda on the international level, where do we have to focus? It's either it should be at the individual scale, which we have done it in the past while implementing the MDGs even before than that, or we should first focus on the institutional level and then go about doing the technology part of it. This is just a query, a question for you to answer. The second area is, well, one option is we talk about capacity development at the national scale, which is quite huge area. So what sort of capacity are we talking about? Or do you think we can start working at the national level, or at the start with the local? When I mean local, at the district or the province level, and then move ahead. So which sort of an capacity development approach might be more appropriate from your experience? And the third area is, of course, it's a bit open for everyone, is that we all talk about we are always critique, and we also talk about the institutional environment behind the recipient countries, but we rarely talk about the institutional environment behind the international funding, international agencies that actually are supposed to facilitate the sustainable development goals. If you see some of the leading funding agencies on water supply and sanitation, one among, well, I don't want to name, it's in its report, it says that the targets, they focus on the targets and the goals. So they always focus on the target. This is from the leading funding agency in the European Union. Now, given these targets, they are not interested in any institutional changes. They are not interested in any larger infrastructure, but they are more focused on building toilets, in situ water supply and sanitation. And this is, in addition to that, this is one of the leading or privately funding, the leading private funding agency in the world. It largely focuses on the technologies of water supply and sanitation. It is not interested in the larger institutional arrangements or in the policy environment. Given this sort of things, we are in fact trying to avoid the international agencies who actually also needs to be built some sort of a capacity, because they work on three or four sort of principles. One is cost effectiveness. Second is based on the targets and goals. They run behind the targets and goals. How do we achieve it? And the third is in terms of, they are actually, given that the many research institutions around the world are largely depending on international funding agencies, and they are largely becoming a mouthpiece for the funding agencies to show that these interventions are more cost effective than a longer term sort of intervention, especially in terms of water supply and sanitation. If you see how Europe has come out of its own filth in 19th century and the early 20th century, it had invested a lot on the institutional arrangement and larger infrastructure. And of course, one cannot make a cost-benefit analysis for the 5 years or even 10 years. And it was only recently that everyone realizes that it is one of the sanitation revolution is one of the significant revolutions that we had, and one of the very good inventions that the 20th century had. So given that sort of a scenario, where do we start focusing on capacity building? You know, or are we supposed to focus on only the recipient countries, or what about the international agencies? Should we change their perspective? Should we make them more sensitive to the common ground realities? In that sense, so what is the role of international agencies, even ZEF for that matter? What sort of role are we supposed to play? Can we have some sort of a sense on the ground? What is the reality, and how do we facilitate the implementation of the sustainable development goals in case to make it effective? I think I would stop with that, and I will leave the floor open who can comment on Utta's, but I request Utta to start with that, and then we will open the floor to the larger audience. Thank you.
Can I join you here? I think the first two questions you posed to me are kind of related, because it's really the questions, what do we do first, and which level of capacity of the capacity system do we focus on, right?
Yes.
And the answer is, we really need to have that multi-level focus. We really need to have that multi-level effort, because capacity development takes so much time. So you can't just say, well, let me train all these people first, and then I change my organization, then everything will run well. Both processes take time. Changing organizations takes time, but also training people, really training them profoundly. Of course, short courses, etc., which are also very important, but really profoundly providing people with new skills and insights takes time. And then the process of them to really apply it in their work setting to make change. Both processes at the individual level, at the organization level, really take time. And you also mentioned then the national level, the regulatory setting, but also the national policies that are now trying to, we increasingly see this call coming back from the countries to us saying, well, you helped us train so many people. And you see, you work with this ministry and you work with this university, and that's all very well, but overall it's just not coming together. So the events that I mentioned earlier, the expert workshop, but also the symposium we held, really the final message is that you need some mechanism at the national level to really tie it together, to really make all this patchwork of efforts into something more coherent. Now, that's not arguing for a planned economy or a planned capacity development overall. It's a distributed process, but somewhere the lines are coming together so that really overall you get improved sector performance. Right? And that includes the policy setting as much as individual organizations at district level, at local level, really improving sometimes it's through we see it in some countries, they do that national capacity development strategy implementation by really feeding in the individual assessments to the national level and then coordinating it there. And the countries that are particularly dependent on donors, that's the framework, that's the mechanism through which the money can feed in, but not just fizzle out. Yeah? But it's being distributed and allocated more smartly than it's been done so far.
Okay. Thanks, Uta. And on the levels of interventions, whether at the national level or at the micro scale with the regional, and start with that and then move forward?
Well, the national strategies for capacity development is a mechanism for being busy at all the different levels. Because you delegate down, you kickstart processes at the local, at the district level, at the regional and national level, but in a coherent fashion. You develop a template for saying this is how you assess organizational capacity, and you can also identify which of your staff need training, feed it back, and then let's see, what pot of money do we have overall, what can we allocate? And then you kickstart also a process of making this a regular process, not just one-off, not just 1 year, but year after year, and organizations get better at it, and they are able to pinpoint and highlight capacity gaps more quickly.
Okay. Now I leave the floor open for any queries and comments. Of course, Uta is there to answer those.
Yes.
My name is Rabia Tawfi from Cairo University. I'm a guest researcher at the DIE, one of the partner institutions organizing this event.
Yes. No,
Yes. Yeah. I like very much your focus on the local level, but I'm working on another level because I'm more interested on transboundary water issues, and I think one of the things that were mentioned in the World Water Day discussions, the website, is the competition over water resources between countries, and I was wondering whether you're actually considering also capacity development at the level of river basin organizations, negotiation, compromises between different countries, struggling for the same resource or fighting
Absolutely. Absolutely. The topic of water conflict is a very important one. It's even a specialization within the postgraduate education that we offer at IHE. And there's a lot of demand for it. It's a big problem. And just like we work with utilities, we also work with river basin organizations.
Any other? I think you can introduce yourself because many of us may not know.
Sure. My name is Olga Horn. I'm working with ICLE, Local Government for Sustainability. And I wanted to go back to the diagram that you showed, and I was wondering if you could maybe explain civil society, like capacity development at that level a bit more. Right now, I just saw briefly that you mentioned water literacy and resilience, but what is it really, and do we dare talk about like changing social norms, and how does it differ also from the individual level?
Right. Okay. Are you there?
Is this the one?
Yeah. Yeah, very good question. Thank you. I guess our starting point is that we train water professionals. So that's why we start at the individual level, the people that are embedded in organizations, so in their professional role. But civil society certainly is a very important stakeholder, of course. And when we talk about capacity at that level, it's knowing about the importance of hygiene, importance of sanitation, etc. And I'm so glad you asked this question because it gives me the opportunity to tell this little story about it. Previously at IHE, we had a different organizational structure, and one of the managers was involved in a project in Lake Victoria, where there was a lot of awareness raising going on at the civil society level, handing out leaflets, educating people about the importance of sanitation and hygiene. And really that process was an eye-opener for her, because people were not, at the end of the day, were not as interested in sanitation and having sanitary facilities as they were in having a mobile phone that must work at all times. And so the importance of what do we mean by development, what does civil society value, and what do we mean by water literacy compared to other competencies is a very important question. I think admittedly in our work, and also because of our mission, we reach the civil society level less often than we do reach the individual level of people in their professional capacity.
Yeah. I'm Charles Ochiri, a PhD student here at ZEF. I think at the concluding part of your presentation, you talk about the bottom-up monitoring, where because of telecommunication, people are able, the grassroots or the locals are able to feed into the monitoring of these programs or the framework of the SDGs. But what I've also seen is that the planning itself is more centralized at the top. Then we come down for the people to make contribution. So somebody coming to contribute from something he has no idea, then of course I can see that the planning framework and the monitoring framework are totally different. Yeah. And obviously, I think the success rate might be very low. And I come to my second part. It's linked to what Dr. Saravanan was talking about the institutional framework within the countries. Because if you look at what is pertaining in most developing countries, even basic laws, it's very difficult for them even to implement them. How successful are they going to be in the capacity development of even water? Even the existing situation, the existing framework is terrible. They are not able to do the basic things. Then of course, at the end of the SDGs, you may not be successful.
Do you want to respond or?
Yeah. Yeah, the first point was the discrepancy between planning and monitoring.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very important one. I think it's one that certainly by the Open Working Group is being realized and addressed as much as possible. But yes, it comes down to individual countries to implement the SDGs and to run their country internal processes. But also, again, that's why I think capacity development is so important, to close that gap and to make sure that there's consistency between what's being planned, what's being implemented, and what can therefore be monitored. And the second point was also the importance of capacity development for achieving the SDGs, because you said that the capacity...
I'm looking at the capacity development within the water aspect and within the larger framework. Because you look at the basic institutions, some countries, they are virtually not existent. Like even simple prosecution of corruption cases. So how can we expect capacity to be developed within maybe the water system, whilst even the larger group is not, nothing much is happening?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think the point is very valid, and it's a very important one that relates to not just training people textbook knowledge, but really changing attitudes of how to behave. You know, that also comes back to the issue of norms. And that's why efforts like the Water Integrity Network, Wehn, or the OECD with its water governance principles is really trying to analyze, the OECD is trying to analyze what are these water governance principles, how can we overcome corruption, and Wehn is also doing a lot of capacity development and awareness raising efforts of overcoming corruption by really focusing on integrity instead.
One thing which I want to ask is, how do we manage the politicking in each and every recipient countries? When I say politicking, how do we handle not only corruption, but also the politics behind it? Because in many countries, they would prefer for the legislations or the policies to remain as it is. It's much better for them that it remains without any change, because even, for instance, if you want to price water, it's a big of a challenge for them. They lose their vote banks in the process. So the politicians who are elected in most cases wouldn't like to change it. So they would like as much as possible to keep the vote bank. Of course, in many countries it is changing. It is changing at a long period of time, since 1992 Dublin Principle it is. So it takes a very long time to change this sort of an attitude, which is we are talking only about water pricing, but there are a lot of things. Like corruption he was talking about, but it's much more than that. Now this would take certainly a number of decades, or I don't know how much, but how do we handle it in a very strategic way?
It's a very difficult question, and we don't have all the answers, and we also realize that it is that long-term process, and you need to use various efforts and modalities. But what we do find is is of course by training various people, various stakeholders, that over time you do generate a critical mass of people that have a different view, that have a different insight, and then hopefully can find their way through that institutional setup against the stream to change things. But what we also do is knowledge networks, where we really bring various stakeholders together around certain interests. They do capacity building and research efforts together. The agenda is being set jointly with policymakers, so we really improve the processes. You can see that sort of neutralizes some of the politics, because you're working at the knowledge level, at the science level, of producing new insights, rather than facing the politics the whole time.
Let me just.
Yes.
You were talking about this high level versus the open working group on this dedicated goal for water. And there are also those from the water community. Having a dedicated goal for water will definitely also dilute or lose the prominence of water in other goals. So, I mean, the high level goal, the panel they were just talking about, what is the cross-cutting thing? It's a connector, it's not a sector. So what do you think, I mean, how is it going to be to affect the future of water in other goals? The other thing is not about the levels, but about the kind of capacity development that we need. Where is the capacity limit in terms of, like, is it about like the safe access to water? What is safe? Improved access to water. What is improved? So these kinds of, in the joint monitoring program, there were this kind of definitions were very much discussed about, and there was no kind of agreement on this. So do you see priorities in terms of the kinds of capacity development that we have to jump into when we start in terms of water capacity development?
Right, first of all you asked about the future of water in the SDGs. So it's basically a question of whether the governments go for the columns or the rows in the matrix that we have. Right? So we have, the columns are the SDGs, and the rows are the cross-cutting issues. And the question is, where do we end up? Do we end up being a cross-cutting issue, or do we end up being a solid water goal? And yes, arguments can be made for either way. The general consensus, I thought, in the water sector was really pointing towards having a strong goal. And yes, you can turn around and say, yeah, but you lose the prominence in the other goals. But the prominence in the other goals is more hidden, because it's a target or sometimes even indicator level. So in terms of traction, of what are these SDGs going to be used for? They're going to be used for getting donor funding to say, look, if we do this project, we're directly meeting SDG number 6 on water. So that's a lot of the political interest, structural, strategic interest that's behind the whole formulation of, should we be a row or a column? Should we be at the target indicator level, or should we be at the SDG level? And the other question was really in terms of the priorities. I think that comes back to, how do we define a water goal, and therefore how do we define the water-related issues? And I think those vary so much at the local level that I wouldn't presume to say at the global level, this is the one theme, the one water-related theme where capacity development must really focus. Because what we see in our work is there's really demand for the whole range. For access to water, access to sanitation, but also issues to with floods and drought, really true water security issues. It depends where you live. So it really depends on the local issues, and that's the point of the SDGs, to me at least. And that's also the purpose behind them, is to say, yes, we define them at the global level, but they have to be implemented and applied in the local level. And in some countries, water issues will be more to do with drought, and in others they will be more to do with floods. Yeah, so that's why to say that at a global level, I think is not so meaningful.
Any comments or any queries seeking clarification?
Okay, then I chip in this. Okay, I think looking at the SDGs, I want your personal opinion. How do you think it will be very successful? Like
well, it depends what the measure of success is.
Yeah.
What's the measure of success? The
Like,
measure of success would be
the number of targets and the sub teams. Do you think we are going to achieve maybe 50% of them, or maybe achieve maybe 60%, or we come back again like the MDGs and again run around and do the same thing again?
no. So the question is really, does it matter? Is it worthwhile?
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah, I think it is.
And maybe how realistic it is.
And I think it is, not because I think it's such a wonderful process or the outcomes so far are so fantastic, but I think it's a very important process to go through. Because the worst thing we could do is nothing. The worst thing we could be doing is nothing. And we won't arrive at the perfect SDGs because at the end of the day, it's a political process that they go through. We may have had scientific input so far. We may have had input from the civil society, etc., from all levels, from all stakeholders, but at the end of the day, it's still negotiated at national level between governments. So the outcome is going to be an outcome of a political process, of a fight between rich and poor countries, between various camps that are forming. But nevertheless, we need to have that fight, we need to have that process. If nothing else, it's an awareness-raising process at all levels. And that's the important thing that we need to have. Because, and that's where I agree with certain lobbyists, business as usual is just not an option. So arriving at the perfect SDGs, I don't think is the point, and we will not, I think by definition. And if we reach 50% of them, then I think we can say hurrah, because that's already a great achievement.
On which level do you feel that you have most impact in terms of like investing all the resources of your institution, obviously, like which of those capacity development levels, where do you feel that, yes, you can actually have a positive return on investment, or like where do you see that you get actually most output from?
I think at the individual and organizational level, and to a lesser extent at the enabling environment level, and that's because we have that parallel effort, because we do the education and training, postgraduate level, but also short courses, etc. So we do the formal training part at the individual level, and at the same time we have more than 120 capacity development projects going on in the country. So we really have that parallel effort. But most of the capacity development projects really focus at the organizational level rather than the enabling environment.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Sarichi from UNU. I'd like to know the process of how these SDGs and MDGs are implemented, right? They are derived, the core indicators have been developed, and then you expect the national governments to use this as a basis to ask for donor funding to implement some of these projects towards achievement of some of these goals. Wouldn't it be possible to actually set aside a funding mechanism and then having actual cost of how much it will cost to implement all these goals that have been set up in the goal, so that this funding mechanism actually allocates funding for their implementation? As it were, you develop it and leave it to anybody at all to use it the way you want to be used, or to apply the way you want to be applied. 5, 10 years down, like you come back again to like the question he just asked, and then go to the same process again. Most of these goals will not be achieved. At best, 20-30% will be achieved. At worst, 70% will not be achieved. And then you go through the process again. So will it actually stop and promote reduced poverty?
Yeah, I think the point is very valid, and I think it's also a point that has been learned compared to the MDGs. Because the MDGs were just that agenda without the financing mechanism. Whereas right now, this year, there's a lot of emphasis. There's the specific groups working on the financial aspects of the SDGs. And then also the implementation goal, number 17, is specifically focusing on the finance and on the finance mechanism, and how do we actually couple different sources of finance, how do we also bring the private sector into play more, because this is not just, a donor, recipient country game. This is, the various actors in society coming together to really achieving sustainable development together, ideally. In practice, we will have to see. We will have to see, and it comes back to the question of corruption, of whether we can drive the process better within the countries this time, so that pots of money are not just received and disappear in various pockets.
I just want to add to it how the process of the financing is done. There are three sort of mechanisms. One is the project-based funding, which many international agencies are able to do it. Then the second is sector-wide funding. So the money is given to the government. When I say project, the money goes to the local government, and the government has to do whatever the funding agency tells. So it should be on water supply, sanitation, water aspects, and so on and so on. So it is a negotiation between the international funding agency and the local government where the money is actually channeled and implemented. This project-based funding is very clear for the international agencies to monitor what is going on and how it is being done. But it also comes with a clause. You know, there's the conditionalities put by the funding agencies. Many times the recipient countries negotiate, well, they don't agree or they negotiate on that. So this is one mechanism. The second mechanism is sector-wide funding. So the international funding agencies give the funding to the local government, and it comes under one sector. So if it is water sector or something, then it comes under one sector, and the money is channelized. There is a little bit of conditionalities attached to this sort of funding. The third funding is, which is being promoted a lot through the various declarations from Accra to Dusan's declaration. It is requesting international agencies to come with less of those conditionalities, but give the funding and give the freedom to the local government so that they have more freedom to maneuver with the funding. But the international agencies are not confident with that given the corruption issues and so on. So if you see how much of water supply sanitation funds have been implemented to implement the MDGs, is around 70 to 80% of the funds were given through project-based funding, and little bit on sector-based, and very few percentages was just given to the local government to implement it. But they're trying to change it, and this change will also take some time because there needs to be a trust between the international agencies and the local government. So this trust building process is also a big issue. On one side there is the corruption issues that they tell. International agencies also have their self-interest of promoting certain things. So how do we negotiate these sort of things? You know, that's the point. Yeah.
Just let me ask you a question of this sustainability of capacity development, kind of who invests on capacity development? How can we make it sustainable? Maybe a business approach for capacity development of the private sector. We have been discussing this 2 years ago, and what is it like now in the SDGs and the negotiations? Is it being discussed or?
Well, you see, as far as the second part of your question is concerned, I'm more an observer and lobbyist than really a participant of the whole process. So I can't tell you the current thinking on that, other than from our side it's very wishful to say, yes, of course, capacity development should be done in a sustainable manner. In practice, what we see is that we don't just get demands from governments for a capacity development project, we get them from the private sector. We get them from the private sector in Europe, who's trying to roll out technology in the field of hydropower, etc., irrigation, and say, yeah, it's very well for me to go to Ethiopia and Rwanda, but then, you know, the operation and maintenance, if I send my own consultants there over the years, it's going to cost me a bomb. And there are local people who could do this. And so the thinking is now evolving. You see the private sector is increasingly becoming aware and also thinking of what kind of business model can we set up where we have a sort of a little feedback loop from the revenue stream that we generate with the implementation of hydropower solutions, irrigation, etc. And say, let's invest that in capacity development. And not just after we've come there with the technology and put it into place, but at the start of the project, when we start thinking about it. That's immediately at the same time, we develop capacity at various levels. From the policymakers, from the people who have to give environmental assessments, etc., to the people who do the actual operation and maintenance, as a sort of ecosystem of capacity development services around a particular technology.
Yes.
I have one question which touches a bit upon that. Currently, we have these 179 targets spread over these 17 goals, and at the bottom of it, the means of implementation, and capacity development is usually covered in the means of implementation at the bottom of the goals.
Yeah.
And we don't know whether they are going to stay there or whether they're going to disappear.
Yeah.
The good thing is, of course, this goal 17, which has capacity development again as a separate one, and assuming that probably the goals will persist throughout the discussions, it will at least remain there.
Yeah.
So now, two questions is, on one hand, the water goal is very diverse already. So the question one is there anything that you think has not been covered well? And then number two, if anything is likely to happen with all these targets, is probably the sift out where there's too much duplication between them to reduce the number or to try to have cross linkages. Is there anything where you think wording could be integrated on capacity development to anchor it in the target? So, I don't know, let's say integrating capacity development in the establishment of sustainable operations and practices and infrastructure and things like that, so that it is part of the element of what you want to achieve rather than something in goal 17 that you have to kind of somehow integrate. Because in the end, everything boils down to being finance constrained and people have to make choices on what they're going to do. Yeah. If you develop infrastructure and then in goal 17 there's something about capacity development to make sure there are people to maintain the systems, to run operations, to do maintenance and all these things, then usually that is where the money ran out, and there might be a little bit for alibi reasons to say that one has done capacity development, but it's detached. So do you think there are opportunities to make sure capacity development can probably be integrated in goals or in targets the way they're formulated?
It sounds to me like you are the opportunity. You should be part of that drafting group. You just made a very good case. Are you?
No. Well, we're influencing or we're providing input to it, but
no, I think you finished the scene very well. I mean, A, you have referred only to the goals that the open working group defined, right? Yeah. There are competing proposals. And the Secretary General report already is a sort of cross-cutting report that sort of says, well, you all seem to be saying this, and you all seem to be saying that, and they're trying to sort of get the common denominator out of all these proposals. Huh? So, yes, luckily capacity development is pitched very strongly in the open working group's proposal on the goals and targets, but less so by the high-level panel, and less so elsewhere. Huh? So, yeah, there's still quite a battle to be won. But I think the concrete suggestion you're making of how it should be integrated in the targets at the target level, really make it a more essential rather than a tag-along aspect, I think that's a very important one. I personally don't have access to that process, and I don't know whether you do. It's less transparent, I think, at this stage, of exactly how these drafting groups are being pulled together. As far as I know, IHE has not been asked provide details on how to translate the targets on capacity development related to the water goal into indicators. Seems to me we could be quite a good contributor, but yeah, we're not part of that process forming. And that's, we come back to the political process. We just have to see how these aspects that we think so strongly around, how they make it through that political process. And the other question was the diversity of the goal. Water aspects that are being mentioned. I think that, again, the open working group is the comprehensive goal. Also, when you look at what the Sustainable Development Solutions Network from Jeffrey Sachs, what they are proposing, yes, they put it as a cross-cutting issue, but a very comprehensive one. But it's less comprehensive from the high-level panel. I think it's still a WASH plus version of the water goal. So if I had to pick one, it probably wouldn't be from the high-level panel, because I think it leaves too many of the water security aspects, the broader conceptualization of water-related issues, important water-related issues out.
So, I think all of you are tired, I think so.
Hungry.
I'm hungry too, okay. How many of you think that the SDGs, if it goes as business as usual and with the addition of capacity building or something, can it be better than the MDGs? Please raise your hands, just to know what sort of views you might have how many of you are confident that the SDGs will be better than the MDGs? Okay, so a lot of crowd are a bit pessimistic about SDGs. Okay, we look forward for it. First and foremost, we want to see that SDGs, whatever statement they made, they have capacity in it and they come up with that by the end of the year, and we'll see what is being done. Okay, but we should thank Dr. Wehn for coming all the way for this talk. And thank you to all of you for coming for this World Water Lecture series. Thank you.